Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast. It is a continuation of last week's podcast, so I very much encourage you to go back and listen to Revenge of the Normies, Part 3A, Media Matters, first, in order to understand what we're discussing. If you choose to proceed, just know that you're kind of missing out on some of the context, but you'll still get a pretty good idea of what we're talking about today. This is Revenge of the Normies, Part 3B, Media Matters. Having laid the groundwork for the unprofessional way the current media constructs its stories, I'm going to lay out for you now a truly egregious and extremely controversial example. You are either someone who hears people out and looks at things reasonably, or you're someone who can't even listen if they already have strong feelings. Someone who is ruled by their visceral reactions. Are you a facts don't care about your feelings person, or a my feelings don't care about your facts person? You can't be both. It's time to decide which is more important. George Floyd, who had previously been arrested using several aliases over his lifetime, was arrested in 1997 for distributing cocaine, and in 1998 for aggravated robbery. He was arrested again in 1998 for theft, and in 2001 for failure to identify to a police officer. In 2002 for possession of cocaine, and later in 2002 for criminal trespass. In 2004 he was arrested for distributing cocaine again. In 2008, for aggravated robbery with a firearm, after he and others posed as workmen to gain entry to a home where they shoved their gun against the young mother's abdomen, terrorizing her small children. He was arrested again in 2019 for a narcotics violation, and on the day he died, May 25th, 2020, the police were called because he had repeatedly tried to pay for goods with counterfeit bills. He was described to 911 as, quote, awfully drunk, and he's not in control of himself. The store employee pointed the police to a car where George Floyd was sitting in the driver's seat. His friend, Maurice Hall, was in the passenger seat, and another friend, Shawanda Hill, was in one of the back seats. The officer told Mr. Floyd to get out of the car 8 times while he continued to resist. His friend, Shawanda, can be heard on the tape yelling at him, "Stop resisting, Floyd." At this point, Maurice Hall and Shawanda Hill tried to leave and were told to come back. The police struggled to get George Floyd off the street, but eventually got him onto the sidewalk where they set him down against the building as another police car pulled up. The police officer ended up asking him if he's, quote, on something, because he was, quote, acting erratic. Mr. Floyd denied having any drugs in his system. This would prove to be a lie. While frisking him, Mr. Floyd continued to resist, and the officer discovered a marijuana pipe in his back left pocket. Mr. Floyd was frantically citing personal issues the entire time throughout this encounter, claiming that his mom had just died, that he was claustrophobic, that he had been shot by police before, that he had just gotten over COVID, etc. Floyd's mother had died 2 years before that, and the last time he was arrested, it had also been caught on camera, and he was not shot during that encounter. His behavior, however, was very nearly identical to his behavior the day that he died. On both tapes, he refused to follow instructions, acted very agitated, resisted at every point, while rapidly making excuses rather than simply complying. In both cases, he claimed that his mother had just died, and began immediately and erratically pleading with the police not to shoot him, while not following their instructions for the safety of both parties involved. And just like on the day he died, he had just consumed a large quantity of drugs as the police were pulling up. On the day he died, pills were recovered from his vehicle containing methamphetamine and fentanyl. A similar pill can be seen in his mouth on video as he was first speaking with police. I've included those pictures at my Substack article, so if you go to Views of an Outsider at Substack, you can view the pictures yourself. More of these pills would later be discovered in the police car, where they had tried to place him. They had DNA from George Floyd's saliva on them. As they continued to try to get him into the squad car, Officer Derek Chauvin first arrived. George Floyd said, quote, when I start breathing, it's going to go off on me, man. Presumably, he was referring to a coughing fit from COVID, but that was unclear as he was behaving strangely and speaking very randomly. The struggle to get him into the car escalated again as he increased his frantic resistance. This was when Floyd first began to claim, I can't choke, I can't breathe. At this point, he was still in the squad car with no one kneeling on him. A bystander yelled out at Floyd, you're gonna die of a heart attack, man, get in the car. At this point, Floyd was struggling partially on the ground and half in the car. He said again, I just had COVID, I can't breathe. Officer King, who is also black, was the one to place him under arrest at this point for forgery. The struggle with Floyd continued, as did his claims that he could not breathe. At this point, the officers gave up on trying to get him into the car and placed him on the ground instead, at which point he kicked Officer Lane. The officers used the maximal restraining technique, or MRT, and the hobble restraint device as approved by the Minneapolis Police Department in Policy 5-316. Despite these restraints, Floyd continued to kick Officer Lane and scream, I can't breathe. Then he began repeatedly calling for Mama, which is what he called his girlfriend. At this point, Officer Lane called for an ambulance. This was 36 seconds after Floyd had been put on the ground, and before anyone was kneeling on him. After his death, a cell phone video would become the focus of media attention. At first, they claimed that the police brutality went on for 5 minutes. Then they claimed it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Then it was increased again to 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Finally, the media settled on 7 minutes and 46 seconds. But the media did not report to the public that an ambulance had been called 36 seconds after Floyd was put on the ground, and they did not show the public the body cam footage from the police officers who were involved, which tells a very different story from the famous cell phone footage that we all saw. The body cam footage shows that Derek Chauvin was clearly kneeling on George Floyd's shoulder blade, not on his neck. And the medical coroner's office found no damage to George Floyd's airways. They did, however, find lethal doses of fentanyl in his bloodstream. An autopsy was conducted on George Floyd within 12 hours of his death by the medical examiner of Hennepin County, Dr. Andrew Baker. Later that same day, he met with prosecutors and FBI agents. He provided them with his findings, which were that, quote, the autopsy revealed no physical evidence suggesting that Mr. Floyd died of asphyxiation or suffocation. Mr. Floyd did not exhibit signs of petechiae, damage to his airways or thyroids, brain bleeding, bone injuries, or internal bleeding. They list that because those accompany suffocation when that's the cause of death. The report continues, Mr. Floyd had pre-existing health conditions, including a heavy heart and some coronary artery disease, including at least one artery that was 75% blocked. The document concluded that they would have to wait for the toxicology report results, after noting that Dr. Baker had not watched any of the footage related to Floyd's death in order to avoid prejudicing himself, which might cause him to bring some unintentional bias to the autopsy. The next day, prosecutors met with Dr. Baker again. Dr. Baker told them that, quote, There were indications in Mr. Floyd's medical records that he had been admitted to methamphetamine detox. He concluded that his findings were preliminary, and while he had not issued a final report, quote, he opined the ultimate cause of death may prove to be a multifactorial diagnosis. Based on what AB, by which they mean Dr. Andrew Baker, knows so far, the three factors in that diagnosis could be 1, coronary artery disease, 2, any stimulants potentially in Mr. Floyd's system causing his heart to work harder, and 3, the exertion caused by Mr. Floyd's encounter with the police officers. This would depend on the quality and intensity of the encounter. They knew all of this within the first 36 hours. After 3 more days of rioting, the toxicology report came back. Quote, methamphetamine, 19 ng/ml. A dose which he describes as low, but a drug which he describes as being hard on the heart. Quote, fentanyl, 11 ng/ml. A dose which he described as, quote, pretty high, saying, this level of fentanyl can cause pulmonary edema. Mr. Floyd's lungs were 2 to 3 times their normal weight at autopsy. This is a fatal level of fentanyl under normal circumstances. Norfentanyl, 5.6, a metabolite of fentanyl. End quote. Deborah Nelson, a medical professional, says that if George Floyd had told the truth back when the police first asked him if he was, quote, on something, it could have saved his life. Quote, that's proven by what happened the year before when he was arrested by Minneapolis police and he was putting tablets in his mouth. He admitted at some point that he had swallowed a bunch of pills, and the paramedics came and talked to him and took his blood pressure. His blood pressure was extremely high, 216 over 160. And so he ended up going to the hospital. Now, as someone who has a history of high blood pressure in all the women in my family, I know that this is stroke-level blood pressure numbers. Quote, if he had admitted that he had again ingested pills in the car when they were attempting to arrest him, things could have turned out much differently. We all saw the, quote, mostly peaceful protests, as the media stubbornly described them, with cities burning in the backgrounds, that followed George Floyd's death. Every day the protests grew. They spread to other cities far away and even to other countries around the world. Police were attacked with bricks, frozen water bottles, bats, and even with firebombs. So-called protesters smashed and burned police cars, as well as random storefronts. In some cities, innocent civilians, including the elderly, were randomly attacked and injured. Yet when the police called in, asking to escalate their use of force in response to mortars being fired at them, wanting to deploy scat rounds, they were denied the authority to use the scat rounds and were told instead to, quote, stand by. They did not even have riot gear, and they were denied SWAT teams. Many officers were injured. Police were getting a play-by-play over the radio as they watched helplessly, while the looters smashed up T-Mobile stores, Foot Lockers, and liquor stores, but were consistently acknowledged and then told only to, quote, observe and report. After the rioters were done looting these stores, they lit a Molotov cocktail and threw it into the building, lighting it on fire. The looters even began firing gunshots. Police kept reaching out to the command post, asking, what's our plan? What's our plan? Only to receive no reply. Tim Walz called it all, quote, righteous anger, being expressed by, quote, all people of conscience. He not only refused desperate pleas to send in the National Guard, but entirely abandoned those serving under him who were begging him for help by not even bothering to answer them at all. This, while his wife opened the windows of the mansion so she could smell the burning tires for as long as possible. Her words, not mine. The assistant chief ordered the squad cars and everything in the area to be pulled back so that the precinct would look abandoned, in the ludicrous belief that it would not be targeted if it looked empty. This was the response to a mob that was holding up dead, butchered pigs' heads as a threat to the police inside. The trucks began showing up to empty the precinct's museum of its artifacts, as well as collect the guns and ammunition stored there. Interestingly, they also took all the cameras, because they claimed they didn't want the rioters to break them. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jason Fry, then gave up the 3rd precinct as the order came over the radio. Evacuate now, evacuate now. When asked if they meant right now, they confirmed yes, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. As the officers in charge began trying to take a roll call for a safe evacuation, they received another call from the head of 911 saying that their backup system was stored there and they needed the evacuating police to go get the 911 radios. The SWAT team arrived to escort the evacuating police out, who were trapped in the 3rd precinct. When they arrived, they asked the senior officer why they were evacuating. Soon after, they were told, quote, "They're about to breach the back gate." But the police couldn't get out. They radioed, quote, "We gotta go, we're sitting ducks here." On the tape, you hear someone warn that they had breached the northwest corner. They're coming in, we need to move. So one of the squad cars was used to ram through the fence to create an opening and give the police an escape route. You can hear the crowd screaming erratically at this point, "Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo!" as they throw explosives at the fleeing cops. They then scaled the fence like a zombie horde until it collapsed. After that, they lit the building on fire and burned the precinct to the ground. The police's only evacuation route required them to drive the gauntlet, as dangerous mobs threw things, breaking all of the car windows as the police drove away. The police that were not lucky enough to be inside of a vehicle were literally running for their lives amid the projectiles and violence. They ran for several blocks before they could finally be loaded onto buses and truly evacuated. They rode away in silence. The 3rd precinct burned, and the city burned with it. And what did the mayor of Minneapolis say about this? Quote, "The symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life, of our officers or the public. We could not risk serious injury to anyone. But the hundreds of officers from that precinct, including the many black officers, strongly disagreed. Before that day, Americans had never lost a police precinct to a riot in the history of our country. The officers who worked there said, quote, "You can't call it leadership, maybe a lack of leadership. So who made the call to forfeit the precinct to the dangerous and violent rioters, abandoning the civilians in that area to their lawless mercy?" Quote, "They weren't doing anything to control the riot. They didn't let us do our jobs," the police say. But who is they? Surely they are those in charge, the chief of police, Mayor Fry, and Governor Tim Walz. The police body cam footage from the day George Floyd died was not just withheld from the public. It was withheld from the jurors at Darren Chauvin's trial. On June 1st, an independent autopsy report was announced by the Floyd family attorney, Ben Crump. He lied, saying, quote, "George Floyd was a healthy young man." He was followed by one Dr. Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist who claimed, quote, "The autopsy shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problems that caused or contributed to his death." That same day, attorneys from the office of Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison met with Dr. Andrew Baker, who had performed the original and official unpolitical autopsy. He notes, quote, "No bruising in neck. No bruising on back. From the videos I have seen, it appears like his knee is on the side of his neck, not where the structures are." He goes on, quote, "Most cases of untreated hypertension can put you at risk for death. while also noting, quote, certain intoxicants can exacerbate and increase the risk of death. Again, he notes, quote, fentanyl at 11 ng/ml. Deaths have been certified with levels of 3. He concluded, quote, if he were found dead at home alone and no other apparent causes, this could be acceptable to call an OD. Despite this, on June 3rd, Minnesota District Attorney Keith Ellison announced that he would file murder charges against Officer Derek Chauvin. Quote, we've consulted with each other and we agree. Ellison also filed arrest warrants for Officers Alex King, who is black, Thomas Lane, and Tu Tao, charging them with aiding and abetting in a second-degree murder, which is a federal offense. They claimed that they were doing this, quote, in the interest of justice. The next day, on June 4th, a funeral service was held for George Floyd. Activist Reverend Jerry McAfee opened the ceremony with a shout-out to Minneapolis gangs. Quote, on behalf of the pastors and preachers from Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Bloods on the south side, the gangster disciples and vice lords on the south, on the north side, Psalms 27. Both Attorney General Ellison and, quote, Reverend McAfee have a long history of helping gang members, including those involved in the shootings of a Minneapolis police officer. Dr. Tom Harvey, a general surgeon, voiced concern about the autopsy of George Floyd after seeing the body cam footage that shows that he was complaining of shortness of breath even before they attempted to put him into the car, well before he was on the ground and way before anyone knelt on him. Quote, a few days later, I found out that the autopsy report was available online, and so I downloaded the autopsy report and read through it. When I did that, my jaw hit the floor. It reads, quote, no life-threatening injuries identified. And later on, quote, positive for 2019 nCoV RNA. Then cites cardiopulmonary arrest. Contrary to the independent autopsy by the family attorney, which was a hoax, as we will get to later, claiming, quote, no underlying medical problems, several underlying medical problems were listed in the autopsy, including arteriosclerotic heart disease, multifocal severe, and hypertensive heart disease, as well as other unrelated underlying medical conditions like a, quote, left pelvic tumor, etc. Contrary to what his lawyers said, this was not a healthy young man. This was a drug addict with severe heart disease who had a lethal dose of fentanyl in his system, as well as a case of COVID. An article published in a peer-reviewed journal identified 17 errors in George Floyd's autopsy by Dr. Andrew Baker. Quote, in patients that have acromegaly, they tend to die from cardiovascular complications, such as heart attack or arrhythmias. This is a disease which it looks like George Floyd may have had. Quote, I'm not sure if the medical examiners were trying to hide it, but it seems like the prosecutor team was trying to hide it. There's no mention of that in the original autopsy report, nor any of the other reviews. I wouldn't even call them autopsy reports, but other reviews by other medical examiners. Very strange. It raises a lot of questions. The original autopsy was done 12 hours after he was declared dead. The official report that came out a little bit later, I'm told, was changed after the family had a review by 2 other forensic examiners. Those 2 examiners never did a physical autopsy, and in fact, did not view any of the slides or pictures. They complained that they did not have those. The second examiner working for the Floyd family was Dr. Alicia Wilson, who was also a forensic pathologist, but like Dr. Baden, never examined George Floyd or even the physical evidence. And they did work for the Floyd family. Quote, when I found out that FBI involvement was within 12 to 24 hours, That really raised a red flag for me. The FBI conducted a meeting with Dr. Baker, which really raised another red flag. I think there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered with this. And when I study what happened and how people and our leaders reacted to this, I just shake my head in almost crying compassion of what has happened to Minneapolis. And instead of bringing people together, we had the opportunity to do that, but I think opportunity was taken to drive us apart. At the deposition of Amy Shazy on August 21st, 2023, she said, quote, "I was referring to a conversation that I had with Dr. Baker on Tuesday, the Tuesday after Memorial Day. I don't know the date, but I know it was Tuesday. And that was the day that the news hit about George Floyd in the morning. I called Dr. Baker earlier that morning to tell him about the case and ask him if you would perform the autopsy on Mr. Floyd." She goes on, "Dr. Baker, I don't remember if he said he would do it or not, but he did do it. He called me later in the day on that Tuesday, and he told me that there were no medical findings that showed any injury to the vital structure of Mr. Floyd's neck. There were no medical indications of asphyxia or strangulation. He said to me, 'Amy, what happens when the actual evidence doesn't match up with the public narrative that everyone's already decided on?' And then he said, 'This is the kind of case that ends careers.'" We know what happened next. Derek Chauvin was put on trial for murder. Despite our supposed right to a fair and speedy trial with an impartial jury, race hustlers took to the airwaves to further poison the jury pool. Al Sharpton, the biggest grifter of them all, said, quote, "Chauvin is in the courtroom, but America is on trial." Nancy Pelosi said, "Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice." A statement that doesn't make any sense, even if what she claimed happened was what actually happened. And Joe Biden said, quote, "But even Dr. King's assassination did not have the worldwide impact that George Floyd's death did." Joe Biden has always had a very ugly record for saying racist things, but to compare Dr. King, who died fighting for civil rights, as being less important than a repeat criminal who died, from all appearances, of an overdose. Or even if he did die from the actions of the police while taking illegal drugs and committing forgery, which would be tragic, but it is still not fighting for civil rights, that is beyond insulting to Dr. King's legacy. By the end of March, when they started selecting the jury for the trial, barricades had to be set up around the Hennepin County Courthouse. The courthouse had to be ringed with concrete, barbed wire, and soldiers from the National Guard. Nearby businesses were closed and windows were boarded up due to fears of arson and the rioting and looting that had occurred after Floyd's death. The crowds outside were worked into a frenzy and began shouting, "Say his name." Genevieve Hansen, a bystander that day who also happened to be a firefighter, was allowed to testify not only as an eyewitness, but as an expert witness. I'm going to play you a clip of her testimony.
So tell us about that. So at some point when you're there at the scene still, did a fire truck come?
Yes.
And they're coming to respond to the call.
They're coming to respond to the call, and they went into Cub Foods to actually look for a victim, which is unique for that, there to be that much miscommunication.
Mr. Nelson. You testified that you've been a firefighter now for 2 years approximately?
Correct.
And I see you're wearing your uniform today?
Correct.
And that would be like your dress uniform or your Class A uniform?
Correct.
And that's common to wear when you testify in court?
Correct.
Fair to say that you were not wearing your Class A or any uniform on May 25th, 2020?
Correct, I was off duty.
Right. Okay.
Are you really a firefighter?
Yes, I am from Minneapolis.
Okay, bro, get on the sidewalk.
Check his right
Charles, check his
now.
pulse. Get back on the sidewalk. The man ain't moved yet, bro.
Where?
Where?
Minneapolis.
Okay.
is it reasonable to assume that if a patient is having a medical emergency and the police are present, that they have called for EMS?
Your question is unclear because you don't know my job, so
Okay.
can't answer.
Sure. So let's take this scene, right? May 25th, 2020, you walk upon a scene, you see someone having a medical emergency, right? You did not call 911 to get the medics there, right?
Right.
Would it have been reasonable to assume that medics had already been called based on what you saw when you first arrived?
Yes.
They're calling for EMS.
EMS is on the way. And in fact, paramedics did respond, right? You saw the ambulance come up.
Yes, that's not their normal response time.
Okay. And so you noticed there was some abnormal response time for medics.
Right, and I also noticed that that is precisely the kind of call that fire would respond to, and Station 17 is just a couple blocks away.
Okay. So do officers on scene decide, do we call for medic or fire?
I don't believe so. I believe that's dispatch. They call for medical.
So if
attention.
Police call dispatch and they say EMS, we need EMS code 3, it's dispatch who decides, do we send medics or fire?
Well, it would be medic. It would be fire with medics, not just fire ever. I don't know the answer to that.
Fair enough.
There were
Body cam footage also shows Officer Lane trying to save George Floyd by performing CPR. If you'll remember, this is one of the officers charged in aiding and abetting in his murder. This is also the officer that George Floyd repeatedly assaulted by kicking him. This body cam footage that shows Officer Lane heroically trying to save the life of his assailant, performing CPR, also captures the miscommunication between the EMTs and the fire department who went to the wrong location. The police had nothing to do with it. Yet none of this exculpatory evidence from the body cam was allowed in at trial. Chief Madeira Arredondo testified after being confronted with a side-by-side of the cell phone footage versus the body cam footage, both of which shows Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd. He agreed that even though the cell phone footage was shot from an angle that made it look as though Derek Chauvin was kneeling on George Floyd's neck, the body cam footage clearly shows that his knee was actually on his shoulder blade. But both he and Officer Katie Blackwell testified that a photo showing a similar restraining technique with a knee placed on the shoulder blade was not standard police training, but rather some unidentified, improvised restraining position used at random by the officers that day. Again, you can see pictures of all of these things in my Substack article. Carolyn Palenti, Derek Chauvin's mother, swears that technique was indeed part of police training. And you might dismiss that since she is, after all, his mother, but she has his training manual to prove it. And an illustration of the MRT technique is in there. I've provided that illustration. Quote, "The chief of police at that time told a frickin' lie," she says. Only recently has Derek Chauvin spoken to the media. He says MRT was part of Minneapolis police training. Quote, "In fact, I'm looking at it right now." The tape of his call plays. Quote, 5-316 maximum restraint technique, which in the manual says, quote, "Officers shall monitor the restrained subject until the arrival of medical personnel if necessary or transfer to another agency occurs." Derek goes on. The EMS and Minneapolis fire response was not normal. Normally, both those resources are sent. They arrive in short time, especially on a Code 3 situation. In this case, Minneapolis Fire took 20 minutes plus to arrive, and their station's 8 blocks away. At the end of the day, the whole trial, including sentencing, was a sham. When asked about the fact that his defense attorney wanted to show a picture from the manual which depicts MRT to the jury but was denied by the judge, and whether Derek thought that was a critical part of his defense, he responded, quote, "I think it certainly is important. Just the fact that it's a PowerPoint training presentation that the city of Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Police Department, delivered using that photograph, that at least illustrates some of the training techniques that are performed. I have listened to 7 other Minneapolis police officers who swear that they were trained in the maximum restraining technique, as were all officers, bravely coming forward to say that their chief lied, even though it sent one of his own men to jail. In fact, if you compare even the cell phone footage of Derek Chauvin, not the exculpatory body cam footage, but the original cell phone footage, to the photo in the training manual that Judge Cahill refused to let the jury see, the placement of Derek Chauvin's knee is actually further away from the neck than the one in the training manual. The judge not only refused to allow the jury to see this evidence on MRT training, but he also refused to let them see evidence about the miscommunication between EMS and the fire department. He excluded George Floyd's prior drug arrest, a history that was relevant, given that it appears he died of an overdose, and there was a conflict of interest issue with the judge, too. Judge Cahill worked for 10 years at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, the same office that was prosecuting the 4 officers. Judge Cahill was also involved in one of Maurice Hall's open cases over possession of a firearm and felony domestic assault strangulation. This is the same man who was in the front seat with George Floyd and who wouldn't testify about that day with Floyd under his Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate himself as a drug dealer. The man who trained Alex King, the black officer who was also accused, said that out of the approximately 1,000 men he had trained, King was one of the top 2 or 3. On March 12, 2021, the city of Minneapolis settled with Mr. Floyd's family for $27 million, a settlement that was broadcast while jurors were being selected for Derek Chauvin's trial, poisoning the jury pool with his implied guilt. It was the largest civil settlement of its kind in history, making headlines. U.S. Representative Maxine Waters repeatedly said on air, quote, "We are looking for a guilty verdict." When asked what protesters should do, she said, quote, "We've got to stay on the streets. We've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business." With even a U.S. senator threatening the jury, ordinary protesters followed suit. But the judge refused to intervene to keep the jury away from the media coverage, other than instructing them not to watch the news, but making no restrictions on their social media or internet access, saying, quote, "A congresswoman's opinion doesn't really matter a whole lot." The jury knew if they acquitted him with their verdict, there would be more riots. They had only to look at the barbed wire and armed guards every day when they arrived at the courtyard to know that. The jurors were even asked about their opinions of Black Lives Matter as part of jury selection. Quote, "I don't believe in the justice system anymore," Derek's mom says. Derek was sentenced to 270 months. That's 10 years over the presumptive sentence of 150 months. A total of 22 and a half years. Alex King was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Thomas Lane was sentenced to 3 years. And Tu Thao was sentenced to 4.75 years behind bars. Alex King also recently spoke to the media for the first time. When asked if he blamed Derek Chauvin for what had happened, he answered, "I don't. The way I see it is he made the decision that he thought was right. As he did before, he's always been one that was by the book and legally abiding. I think he did exactly what he was trained to do. Unfortunate that the publicity got as riled up as it did by all the officials and politicians that were involved with the case, and it took away any chance he had to even say his piece. I think, unfortunately, we've come to the point now where the justice system has been controlled by mob mentality. Social media, news outlets, peer pressure now control the outcomes of trials and investigations. The justice system no longer is really something you can trust, because if you're in any way on the negative side of the media, you're going to pretty much just have a trial by street. And no one ever wins in trials with publicity that is already against you. There's just no real way to have a fair trial. We have a whole constitutional amendment about that is null and void. Minneapolis has never been the same since George Floyd and BLM. A section of it dedicated to George Floyd is a no-go zone for police. You can break the law there, even murder, with impunity. The police force lost a lot of officers. One officer said, quote, "This news is disgusting and immoral," with what they reported, the lies they reported. When asked about what it was like to respond to emergency calls after the BLM riots, other officers said, quote, "I was the first officer at multiple shootings. I was involved in a gunshot call." And I'm just like, one of these situations is not going to turn out good. I mean, no matter what I do, I'm going to be either next Chauvin or I'm going to be shot and killed. And I go, I've already been injured twice in this job, bad. And now, at the end of my career, I'm going to get hurt again or end up in prison? A third officer was asked why he quit. He said, quote, "I've been in several riots in this city, or protests, or whatever you want to call them, and of all the different riots I've been in, that's probably the first time that I felt helpless. I found myself, for the first time ever, I kind of had a panic attack. It was a sense of helplessness, and that's a shitty feeling. At one point, I woke my wife up at like 3 a.m, and I just told her, I think I could be done." He recalled, fighting back tears. Quote, "It was the drive into the city, the knot in my stomach, the I'm going to vomit, I'm going to be sick. I knew something was wrong," another officer cited. Another officer gave their reason for quitting. Quote, "I left the job about a month after the protest. I just couldn't do it anymore. We were one of the highest trained departments in the country. These were some of the best cops you would ever see in your lives, and a lot of these people are gone." Yet another officer says, quote, "The last call I was ever on should have been a routine call. It was a simple hit and run. An officer just dispatched to a hit and run call. The victim has pictures of the car that took off, a description of the guy, and the guy drives by again. So the officer follows him, stops him. I think we had 4 officers there because people started yelling. I mean, this was just after the riots. Anytime we're out dealing with anybody, especially if a person of color, we were getting all kinds of screaming and yelling and everything else. It didn't take too long before we realized this person was completely high on drugs. He was huge, too. He was probably 6'5". He was tall, way bigger than me, probably twice my size. And he was like, "I'm not going to jail." And I'm like, okay, well, we've got our body cameras on, we've got 4 guys, and I'm thinking, well, this guy is drugged out. And he's like, "I'm not going to jail, I'm going home." Pretty soon the fight's on, and we're fighting with this guy, trying to get him cuffed. We're not hitting him, we're not striking him or anything, but we're going to go to the ground sooner or later because he's a big dude, and we're going to go to the ground. And I'm thinking to myself, dude, if this guy ODs, if this guy dies in our custody 4 white cops at 17th and Chicago, 20 blocks from George Floyd, were going to prison. And I'm looking at these guys and I go, we're going to fucking prison. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. It was a horrible day, he shrugged. Quote, my father was a police officer. I grew up in Minneapolis. My family is here. I didn't want to leave. It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life, another officer says. I still have difficulties with it. You know, I didn't want to go. I loved being a police officer, you know. But, quote, one day sitting there at lunch, it was probably a group of 20 of us, and somebody had said, I heard you're leaving. What's your last day? And I said, well, today, in about 10 minutes. I said, in fact, could one of you guys give me a ride home because I have to leave my squad here? And the one guy who gave me a ride home was like, okay, let's, I got my squad right here. So we're in a marked squad. I still have a uniform on, and I see a guy walking, and I see he's going to raise his hand, and I'm like, oh, hey, somebody wants to wave at us. And then he flipped us off. And I went, holy crap, this was the right decision. Yeah, everything changed. And it didn't have to. Had we had strong leadership right from the very top, the governor, meaning Tim Walz, our mayor, meaning Jason Fry, the chief of police, city council of Minneapolis, the assistant chief, and the deputy chiefs, this is how you treat your people? You just turn your back on us. Quote, I've not been anywhere near the precinct. I can't bring myself to go to the precinct. Quote, I mean, unless I absolutely have to, no. I've even missed a few funerals. One officer who decided to stay said his reason was, quote, well, I think for myself, mainly for pride. I worked really hard to get here, really hard. And I made a lot of sacrifices in my personal life, too. To be able to don a uniform and stand for something. And I could not let evil win. They failed when they gave up that precinct. Our department still hasn't recovered from that. And it's 3 years later. What those in power did to the morale of those who selflessly served the community at risk to their own lives has cost the community itself even more. In May of 2020, there were 892 police officers there. By October of 2023, there were just 512. Nearly half of the number of police they had before politicians deliberately sparked mass trauma for their own election gain. The riots cost Minneapolis at least 380 police officers and deterred who knows how many from joining the force. Quote, I do hear the mayor talk that crime is down, crime is down. Say it with me, crime is down. And by the way, when something is really true, you shouldn't have to argue with the majority of people, making them repeat you like drones in order to convince them it's true. It should be obvious that it's true if it really is. That's the tell of a lying politician. The who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes gaslighting. Quote, I often wonder if we're looking at the same city. Overall, crime is way up. How they ignore that or don't pay attention to that is beyond me. It's just another example of why we're in the situation we're in now. When I came on, we used to have a roll call of about 20, 25 cops. I've had roll calls with 2 cops in them. It's just not enough. Jeremiah Ellison, the son of Attorney General Keith Ellison, loves to publicly promise, quote, this council is going to dismantle this police department. And they have. And the results for the citizens have been devastating. It's time to hold these politicians accountable for their immoral incitements and their downright bad ideas. Former City Council President Lisa Bender likewise said, Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it. NBC asked Joe Biden, do you believe there is systemic racism in law enforcement? Answer, absolutely. The police officer went on to say, quote, this government, not just in Minneapolis, but in the nation in general, has done a very good job all the way up to the White House of demonizing law enforcement. Now with the element, it seems, of happy prosecutors to prosecute officers for mistakes made, makes it almost unbearable to do the job. And the policies passed makes it impossible to do the job that needs to be done. Instead of being held accountable for the violence they stirred up and the devastating results they created, these politicians are allowed to escape the consequences of their bad theories, while assuring us that siding with them will put us on the right side of history. They hire private security, move into gated communities, or move away from the dangerous cities they created altogether. And not one ever holds themselves accountable to the people who trusted them and whose lives they made worse or more dangerous. Crime since the BLM riots has skyrocketed, not only in Minneapolis, but across the nation. There were 101 carjackings in Minneapolis in 2019. The next year, in 2020, there were 388, up nearly 400%. By 2021, there were 655, up 650%. By 2022, they were able to drop it back down ever so slightly to 524, still up by over 500% from 2019, and there's social justice. In 2019, Minneapolis had 266 gunshot wounds. By 2020, it had more than doubled to 551. The next year, it had nearly tripled, 658. And in 2022, there were still 544, so it was still up by over 200%. Minneapolis homicides in 2019 totaled 48. The next year, they rose by over 70% to 84 murders. By 2021, there were a staggering 93, barely dropping back down in 2022 to 81, still up by over 70%. The cities across the country felt the impact from the rise of the violent gang known as Antifa. Antifa is supposed to be short for anti-fascist. Ironic, given that they currently push ideology and behavior in ways that are more textbook fascist than any modern group in recent memory. Shouting, "Go! Run! Now! Racist white people! We'll blow the fuck up! You hear? Come over here with your blue eyes!" screamed John Thompson, Representative-elect for the Minnesota House of Representatives. Quote, "I am going to the state capitol with this same fucking message." This is the kind of politicians Minnesota produces. And Tim Walz, as governor, has led the way every step. Joni King, who taught at 3 different North Side schools, the mother of Alex King, was asked if she believed that the media and city leaders hid the reality that her son is also black. She responded, quote, "I think they had such a hard time walking back a story that they had told that they would have done anything to maintain that story. You know, they have a story, our family has a story, I have a story in my mind about what really went on as well. When I think about the conversation they must have had once the facts came out about the race of the officers, just for the record, out of the 4 officers convicted, Derek Chauvin and Thomas Lane are white, but Alex King is black, and Tu Tao is Hmong American. It's as diverse a group racially as you could have asked for. Quote, about the toxicology report, about the medical examiner's report, about the body cameras. And my story goes, is they're sitting around looking at each other in a room going, okay, now what do we do? The truth and the facts don't match the story we've been telling everybody and the media has been telling. What are we going to do now? And they look around in the room and ask each other, who has the cojones to tell the truth? Is it going to be you, Arredondo? Is it going to be you, Benjamin Crump? Is it going to be you, Mayor Fry? Who's going to be the one who's going to say, oh, oops, we thought that it was this, we were wrong. The facts don't support it. We're going to have to do something. We're going to have to say something. And they must have looked around the room and said, nope, not me. I don't have the cojones. Do you have? Nope. I don't have them either. But they were able to loan a pair, I think, to Mr. Chief Arredondo so that he could, don't worry, we'll borrow you a pair so you can have them to go on the stand and lie about the training these officers have had, since you don't have any to tell the truth. And that actually, is the story that makes more sense with the facts than the one that they were telling. Alex King, the black officer, the policeman who actually arrested George Floyd, was with George Floyd much longer than the approximately 8 minutes that Derek Chauvin was. Alex was with him for almost 18 minutes, from the moment he was handcuffed until he personally closed the ambulance door. Quote, despite, like you said, the fact that I am black and that another colleague of mine, Tao, is Asian, so really half the attending officers were in the minority, I think that was something they just didn't want to admit, specifically my race, because again, it goes very counterintuitive to the way the narrative goes, and they couldn't backpedal. His mother describes what it's like to think of her son in prison. Quote, my greatest fear is that it's going to change who he is, that I just don't know who he's going to be when he comes out. So it is hard to think of him there. Every day is excruciating. And we tell him, we know who you are. We know what a lie this is. And you don't have anything to apologize for. I don't understand how an untruth or a lie can be so accepted without question. This is what happened. This is how they reacted. And this is why they reacted. And this is part of their training. None of that was said. When you're constantly reminded about the worst day of your life and the tragedies that, are in the news every day, the ramifications of that day in terms of how police are treated in the city and how many have quit, and it's gotten so bad. That trajectory, of the fallout of what happened, not just that day, but to the city afterwards, that continues to happen and across the country. I just can't understand why they don't see that. I mean, how can that not be seen? It's not the police that are the problem. Something else needs to change. How can that not be obvious when things have gotten so bad? The city itself has lost its appeal. A lot of trauma, and the plan is to find somewhere else where we can start fresh and not have all the bad memories. Alex gets through each day behind bars as best he can. Quote, prison is a very unique experience, I can say. One I never thought I'd see myself in. But it's very easy to get caught up in a lot of self-wallowing and a lot of whatever thoughts you have in your own head. And the easiest way to do it is to take it day by day. Do little things that you can do here and there to take time off your sentence, keep pushing the days forward, and just keep your head up and know that this isn't the end, and this won't define me. What's been done is done, and I just hope that at the very least, people in the future can keep an open mind and not let instances like this happen. Just use my case as an example, as to not jump the gun, not knee-jerk, not fall to this race bait, to the social media, to the media, and let them get away with what they do. Because if things like this keep happening, no one anywhere is going to have any sense of justice left. A powerful warning, but it's not enough. We can know that those with political agendas, like Tim Walz, Mayor Fry, and Chief Arredondo, didn't have the cojones to tell the truth. That they were willing to send good men who were only doing what they had trained them to do to prison for years of their lives to save themselves. Or to tell a story that would create a frenzy that was profitable for them during an election. We can know that BLM in the end was, financially speaking, a complete scam that used the money they collected to buy luxury properties and didn't help any of the communities it was meant for. We can know that BLM morally is so bankrupt that they sided with Palestinian hang gliders who massacred people at a music festival. We can know that people lied on the stand, that judges kept out relevant evidence, that the media pushed the story they wanted to, and that 4 men are in prison as a result. We can know that despite this, the jury itself said they knew there was no evidence that George Floyd's death was caused by anyone, and knowing they could not acquit, they convicted 4 men of murder on the flimsy grounds that they had in some mysterious way failed to do enough to resuscitate George Floyd, as though that is the same thing as deliberate murder, even if it were true. We can know that even if we want police to be trained differently in future, to punish officers for doing what they were trained to do by us with textbook accuracy is both insane and incredibly unjust. But what are we going to do about it? It's true, we can't give them that time back. But Derek Chauvin was stabbed over 20 times in prison, and he will be there for decades more if nothing is done. None of our leaders had the cojones to do the right thing. Do we? Do you? Will we allow these men to continue to be the scapegoats in exchange for not ruffling any feathers on pathetic social media? Rather than admit that we were manipulated by scummy politicians? Are we willing to make right what we made wrong? Are we willing to take the initial backlash in order to start the ball rolling on a new narrative? Or, like the men who put 4 police officers in jail while knowing better, will we too turn a blind eye? Is our pride in not admitting that we were wrong worth the lives of other flesh and blood people who put themselves in danger every day to protect us? We claim to believe in the standard of innocent until proven guilty. In these cases, not only were these officers not proven guilty of having caused George Floyd's death, but they didn't even prove that George Floyd was murdered at all. All the evidence seems to support that he died of heart failure. brought on by an overdose of fentanyl, which he voluntarily ingested. And if we are truly going to be a society that believes in innocent until proven guilty, then we have to be willing to admit that even in this case, that means the bar is set at proving that the cause of George Floyd's death was murder, and also that the murder was committed by these officers. Neither of those things has been done. So if we want justice, not only for them, but for anyone else, for ourselves potentially, then we must demand new trials, fair trials, non-political trials. If we won't do that, then we're no better than the politicians we condemn. If you marched with Black Lives Matter and don't march to see justice done here, then you're doubly guilty. If you signed petitions for George Floyd but won't sign petitions for Derek Chauvin or the other officers, then you are doubly guilty. If you will only stand up for what you believe is right when you do so as part of a mob, rather than doing so when it means going against what the crowd accepts, then your morality is worthless. And we will all pay the price of living in a society that allows itself to become worthless, unless we decide to aim higher. We have to make right what we made wrong. We have to remember which politicians lied to us and hold them to account. We have to have a zero tolerance policy for that going forward. We need to remove the manipulators from office. We need to prosecute the perjurers. We need to distrust the media sources who pushed the narrative they liked the most instead of the one that was unbiased and true. Quote, "We can either stand for the truth, or we will continue to fall for the lies." Thank you for listening. I look forward to speaking with you next week. I hope you'll come back.